Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. Tonight, I'll be speaking with Menachem Kaiser, Toronto native, now Brooklynite, author and writer whose pieces have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, New York Magazine, Tablet, and elsewhere. Menachem's debut book, Plunder, a memoir of family property and Nazi treasure, was very favorably reviewed in the New York Times and has received tons of other press attention. It starts out with the search for a building owned by his great-grandfather, but expands into a larger story about Nazi tunnels, treasure, long-lost relatives, and more. I found this book to be riveting, a real page-turner, full of twists and surprises, and at least one cliffhanger. Firstly, I'd like to ask our viewers, if you have any questions for Menachem, to please type them into the chat box on your screen, and I'll include as many as I can. Welcome, Menachem, and thank you so much for being here tonight.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much, Randy, and to Beth Shalom for organizing the event.
According to your bio, you were a Fulbright Fellow to Lithuania. What brought you there? How long did you spend there? And what was that experience like?
Sure. And so I did a Fulbright Fellow ostensibly to research Yiddish culture. And so I'd taken Yiddish as an undergrad in Columbia University and then went to sort of study Yiddish as it was used sort of like in everyday conversations and in the academia. When I got there, I found out my proposal was very misguided and there was basically no Yiddish going on in Vilnius. And so I transitioned, my research ended up becoming much more focused on the Vilna ghetto. So I would say that was like my primary area of focus there. And so it was a very tough year. I would say it was the worst and best year of my life. It was very lonely, but very rewarding, and also sort of set me off this path. And that was about 10 years ago. And so it set me up, like it was my entry to Eastern Europe. And ever since then, I've been going quite a bit. And then I would say that was the first domino to fall towards the writing of this book.
Right. You start off the book with memories of your grandfather's yurtzeit. Why were you the only child to accompany your father to shul and his gravesite to recite Kaddish? Is it because you're the oldest male child named after your grandfather, or another reason?
Yeah, it's just, my father's a very early riser. And so he would, go to shul, he would go to synagogue very early in the morning. During the week, in the kind of shuls I went to, there weren't women. There wasn't really an active women's section on, let's say, like a Thursday or something. And so we would go. I was the eldest boy, and later on, my brother, I have a younger brother who's 4 years younger than I am. He would come also, but the family would visit the gravesite. I was on right before Yom Kippur. We would take like a family trip up to the gravesite.
Okay. So you first went to Poland in 2010, decided to visit your grandfather's town, Sosnowiec. Is that the right pronunciation?
Close enough. It's Sosnowiec or Sosnowiec in Polish.
Sosnowiec. And that's when you found out about a property owned by your great-grandfather that your grandfather and briefly your father had tried to reclaim. At what point did you realize that this journey into the past was going to become a book?
That's an interesting question. Not for quite some time, actually. So initially, when I started the reclamation process, I wasn't all that interested in writing a book about it. I didn't really see how it could be done. I didn't really see a way in, and I didn't really see how it would be all that different from other stories of reclamation. So it was very personally meaningful, and it would be meaningful like in the context of my family. But I just didn't really see it as a book. At the time, I was in graduate school working on a novel at the University of Michigan. So I was much more focused on fiction writing. I saw this as like an interesting side project, but not a writing project. I would say, and to spoilers a little bit for those who haven't read the book, it's when I met the treasure hunters about a year later and found out my familial connection with them that the story got so weird and so interesting that at that point I felt like I at least had to try writing a book about it.
Right. So you've dedicated the book, and you are named after your grandfather, Mayor Menachem Kaiser, who died 8 years before you were born and whom you grew up knowing very little about. You state that this gap in family history was normal for your father, that in his circle of children of survivors, no one had grandparents. Isn't this gap of knowledge a type of trauma, one that was passed down from one generation to the next?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's hard to see it as trauma because it just feels it's like a normal within the context of a family and in the context of a community. And so it took me many years to understand repression and sort of this gap of knowledge. And I really like that articulation as a form of trauma, as sort of like it's a void. And so, yeah, I do think sort of our family history really informs our sense of identity. And when you don't have that, when there's like a missing piece, you sort of have to grapple with who you are. And you're right. And so we never had that. But I didn't understand, I would never put it in that language not until just a few years ago. So, but I grew up with it being sort of, yeah, like that's who my grandparents were and that's who my father is and everyone's great. Onward.
Right. You write that when you received the legal file in 2015 of your grandfather's 20-year attempt to reclaim the building, that you saw it as possibly a way to connect with and better know your grandfather. Do you now feel that you have a stronger connection with him after having written this memoir?
I like that question. It's hard because I didn't actually learn more about him himself. So I don't feel like I have a better sense of who he was. But at the same time, I think, yes, the answer is I do have a connection because I really tried. And I think there's something that happens. I came from a place of ignorance about my grandfather, and I also ended up in a place of ignorance. But the nature of that ignorance changed. I would say it went from like an unexamined ignorance to an uneasy ignorance. Like I felt I had really put a lot of work in order to figure out what questions to ask. And I feel like that puts me in a sort of conversation with him that I had never had before. And so even if like my sense of who he was is still very dim and hazy, I spent 5 years sort of working towards him or towards the meaning of him. And that feels very special in its own right.
All my grandparents came to Toronto in the 1920s, but I had so many questions about the old country. I interviewed two great aunts and started a family tree decades ago. Most relatives who stayed behind in Europe disappeared into a void. A few survived horrendous ordeals that I know of. And there were also several who I rediscovered, even people that I had grown up with that I didn't know were distant relatives. I visited Poland 2 years ago, the first in my family to do so. Walking down a street in Kazimierz, the old Jewish quarter in Krakow, I looked up at a street sign and was stunned. It was Miodov Street. Miodov means honey in Polish, and my maiden name is Madonik, changed by my paternal grandfather from Miodownik, honeyman or meadman. So here was something that connected me inextricably to Poland. I later saw pages with this surname in the Book of Names in Auschwitz, and I have no idea how many of them were my relatives. I ended up not visiting my paternal grandparents' village because I didn't know what I'd be looking for. I knew the town, Rakov, but I had no address like you did. And I know for a fact that there are no headstones remaining in the cemetery. Would you say that memory tourists are often not looking for actual property, but searching for something intangible, perhaps part of their identity that was lost when they return to Poland to look for their roots?
Sure. I would say even if they are looking for property, they're looking for something intangible. I just think the properties it just becomes a symbol or a projection of the things they're looking for, even if they haven't been articulated to themselves. And so property is sort of like it's an easy metaphor, if you will, even though it's a literal thing, because you're like, oh, I'm trying to reconnect with my grandfather through this literal like I thought it was his childhood home, even though it turned out not to be. But I think it's just sort of a more tangible version of these intangible questions that you're asking. And so, yeah, there's really a groping. And when you go and you seem to have experiences, Randy, you don't really know what you're looking for. You're looking for something. You're looking for a sentiment or a meaning or a hint or a whisper, and it can be very. Yeah, sometimes you don't even know when you found it, and it takes like a couple of years of processing to like put that experience in context. And yeah, so it ends up being like a very deep and unsettling journey, but one that I have found to be very meaningful.
Right. Your father's siblings and mother lived in close proximity in Toronto, and you grew up very close with your cousins. Then there's a family rift in the 90s caused by a property dispute in which the families become alienated from each other for a time. There's an overlap of these two inheritance disputes and a sense of irony there. I've heard of other rifts over property in families of survivors. Do you think it's more common in these families, maybe because of the historic loss of property and the resultant trauma of that experience? Or do you think it's just human nature?
I don't know. I have no sort of insight into like that. That's an interesting hypothesis that like family properties, family fights regarding property would be more common among descendants of survivors. But I have no clue. I have no insight into that. And so maybe it sounds like a great PhD dissertation for someone one day.
Okay. Are you still close with your cousins?
Yes, very close. And so I'll mention actually that the uncle who appears in the book passed away about 2 months ago.
Oh.
And so, which was well after the publication of the book. And so that actually gave us an opportunity. I was kind of nervous about that. I didn't know how the book would be received by certain members of the family, but so far it's been really smooth sailing. So I went to his funeral, which was in New Jersey, and then I went to Lakewood, New Jersey, to do Shiva, and I saw all my cousins, but I don't get to see them very often, and it was very, really nice, really special.
That's so nice. Have any other relatives traveled to Poland following in your footsteps?
No, but it will happen. People have been wanting to go. People have been curious. I hope to one day take, hopefully my father or maybe some of my siblings to see both the property and, some of the weirder stuff.
As your journey unfolds, you encounter a series of pitfalls and obstacles, but each step in the process provides an opportunity for discovery. After you get the file, you find a lawyer named the killer, but then promptly ignore her advice and visit the building, Malachowskiego 12. Did I pronounce that right?
No. It's a tough one. The L is a W, so it's Malachowskiego.
Okay, I'm not even going to try that.
It took me a long time. Yeah.
You then befriend a few of the tenants who provide quite an elaborate historical background of the building, its inhabitants, and the neighborhood. You also describe quite vividly your emotional conflict interacting with these people. Have you been in touch with Bartek and Hannah, Joanna, or the other people that you met on your journey since the book's been published, and what did they think of it, if so?
Sure. So Hannah actually passed away about 2 years ago. So Hannah passed away, which was very sad. Bartek I'd been in touch with. I actually needed his permission to reprint some of his emails, which I did in the book. So I had been in touch and he understood the book was coming out. I'm not sure if Bartek I don't know if his English comprehension is kind of good enough to read the book, but he definitely knows about the book. We've been in touch a little bit, and the book will be coming out in Polish probably next year.
Wow.
So I'm sure we'll get some interest. And then Joanna sent her a copy immediately. She was very entertained by it. And then I think mostly because of COVID, it's been very hard to get books there. I've just had a really hard time shipping books
Oh,
here to Poland. And so I know there's a whole bunch of the treasure hunters are waiting for their copy. A few of them read it
oh,
on Kindle and they were really excited. And then one of the guys who speaks English really well he's reviewing it for the Treasure Hunter magazine.
oh,
So,
wow.
but
That's unbelievable.
it's been like 2 months waiting for the book, and so
Oh,
but yeah, eventually.
oh, that's so great. The next part of the book introduces Project, is it Reese?
Riza.
Riza, the Nazi tunnel system in Silesia, in southwest Poland, where Sosnowiec is located. You learn about the treasure hunter culture to which you become drawn. How did you first learn about the Golden Train and discover some of the other mythology that you recount in your book?
That's funny. So, it's actually, this part is not quite in the book. I actually had I was teaching in the University of Michigan, and I had a student who tried to write a very ambitious essay trying to persuade me that he knew where Hitler's secret gold stash was hidden. And at the end of the day, it wasn't a very persuasive essay. It was a very entertaining essay. And he mentioned something about that golden train, and I had never heard of it. And so I looked it up. And then there was that big media. In 2016, these two treasure hunters announced to the world that they have discovered the golden train. For those who haven't read the book, the golden train is an ostensibly legendary train full of looted Nazi gold that the Nazis had filled up towards the end of the war in Wrocław, which was then Breslau, sent it towards Berlin, but it got diverted and was hidden inside of a mountain, according to legend. And so for the past couple of decades, Polish treasure hunters have been searching for the train. And in 2016, two of them claimed to have found it. And it set off an international media frenzy. And so pretty much everyone heard about it. There was like the New York Times covered it. The New Yorker did a feature piece. Time did a whole documentary, the Discovery Channel, the BBC. And so it got a lot of news attention in that summer, 2016, and then it sort of died off. And then I sort of caught the end of it, and I was like, this is very strange. I would like to know more about this. So that's how I got involved.
Okay. Once you start to explore the tunnel system with the actual treasure hunters, it doesn't take long for you to learn about Abraham Kaiser, a sort of patron saint of theirs who shares your surname. Can you speak briefly about his memoir and the importance it holds for the treasure hunters?
Sure. So let me start from the back. Let me start from the second question first. So basically, the center of this treasure hunter culture are these things called Project Riza, which Randy mentioned very briefly. And so these are 7 tunnels dug using mostly Jewish slave labor towards the end of the war. And none of them are completed, but the ones that are closer to completion are enormous in size. We're talking square kilometers, you guys are Canadian, so I could use the metric system. It's much easier. So we're talking like, ceilings that are 20 meters tall or rooms that are 100 meters long, but basically like underground cavernous neighborhoods. And what makes these tunnels or underground complexes truly enigmatic is the fact that there is virtually no primary German documentation. And so we don't have like any good German sources as to what they were used for. And because of that dearth of documentation, they sort of take whatever sources they can get and really prioritize them. And so Abraham Kaiser, he was one of the slave laborers, and the story of the memoir is quite amazing in its own right. He stole scraps of cement packaging and stole a pencil. And when he was in the concentration camps, he would write his notes. And before he would be transferred from camp to camp, he would nail these notes to the underside of a latrine. He survived the war. After the war, he was saved by a German woman who hid him. He borrowed a bicycle and rode from camp to camp collecting these notes, these scraps of cement packaging. And he brought them to a Polish editor, and together they turned it into a memoir, which was published in Poland in the early 60s. And this book, it's called Za Drzwiami Śmierci, or Behind the Wires of Death, because of that lack of documentation, has become like the go-to source for these tunnels. And so because it has some details about location or construction methods or which companies or some sort of like layouts for the tunnels, And so that book is just kind of like Treasure Hunter 101. They all study it. I would come to meet treasure hunters who've read it more than 40 times or who follow Abraham's pilgrimage every year. And so Abraham and this book are sort of sacred figures. They've been quite mythologized within the treasure hunter community.
Great. So it turns out that Abraham is actually your relative when you re-examine your own family tree. Then you discover a whole branch of your family in Israel, a legacy you weren't aware of at the beginning of your search. As the process of reclamation unfolds, there seems to be more questions than answers about the building, your motives, and moral dilemmas, internal and external. Can you explain to us about how the change in Poland's government affected your case to reclaim your great-grandfather's property?
Sure. So I was going on this pretty straightforward reclamation case. I just needed to sort of, it sounds like a little Kafkaesque, but basically I was petitioning the courts to recognize the deaths of my relatives who had died in the Holocaust. And so including my great grandparents who were born in the 1880s, so they'd be nearing 140 years old at the time. But it's still a regular court case, and you've got to sort of you got to testify that these people are no longer around and that the court should issue a death certificate. A couple of weeks before my first trial, there was in 2015, a right-wing nationalist government came to power, holding all the branches, which is the first time that's happened since independence from communism. It's called PiS, or the Law and Justice Party. And they set about doing a pretty direct attack on judicial independence, which was the one branch of government they didn't ostensibly control. And so they introduced a series of laws that pretty overtly threatened the independence of judges. And so the ones that received the most attention were targeting the what's basically equal to the Supreme Court. But the ones that affected me the most were basically court administrators. And so putting quite a lot of pressure on judges to sort of decide, politics suddenly became a big issue. And so I was left in the space where I didn't have proof that the judge was sort of undermining my claim, but all of a sudden there was a lot of questions towards the judge's motivations and incentives that could potentially affect my case. And like the nasty thing is, like, once you begin to question independence of a judge, it's very hard to shake that. And so I was kind of left in this quandary, not moving forward.
So this new government in Poland has enacted laws that make it illegal to publicly say or write about Polish complicity in war crimes during the Holocaust. This looks like an attempt to erase or revise history. I think this will be a good place for Menachem to do a reading of part of his book, which is a discussion of memory, meaning, and family stories. Take it away, Menachem.
Sure. Okay. So this section comes after the entire reclamation case is a series of mishaps and errors, as in everything I do wrong. Everything I thought I knew, it turns out to be false. And I just sort of, this part of the book, I'm sort of like, my entire narrative is kind of crumbled. Basically the building isn't where I thought it was, isn't what I thought it was. And I'm sort of grappling with the aftermath of that and what it means for my own mission. Okay. Our origin stories, our stories of where we come from, of where our parents and their parents and their parents come from, are riddled with errors. My grandmother's tombstone, to give a particularly blatant example, it's literally set in stone, says she was born in Oświęcim, but that's wrong. She grew up there, but was born in Rzeszów. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard about someone schlepping to Eastern Europe in order to trace their family story, to follow their memory map, only to discover that they'd had their entire lives a major or minor detail incorrect. The dates don't add up, the train routes are impossible, this address never existed, the ghetto had already been liquidated by then. It always feels surprising, bumping up against an error like this, but it shouldn't be. Family stories are poor preservers of history. They're fragmented, badly documented, warped by hearsay, conjecture, legend. Of course, errors are going to creep in. This seems somehow wrong, even blasphemous, at odds with the private sacredness we impute to our origin stories.
But most stories in most families aren't meant or relied on as preservation of hard information. They're meant and relied on as preservation of soft information, of sentiment, narrative, identity, of who someone was and subsequently who you are. It tells not a historical truth, but an emotional truth. I'd even argue that the built-in uncertainty, often unknowability of details large and small, is essential to the family mythos. We not only receive, but also participate in the story. On some level, we choose to believe, we ascribe. And the truth is that the details most easily corrupted are not details most people care all that much about anyway. What's the difference between number 12 and number 34 when either building is on a funny named street in a city you think about only in terms of dead Jews in a country your family fled from? The mistake of my grandmother's tombstone. I've been bringing it up for years, but no one really cares. We're never going to change it. Because the difference between Bubby having been born in Rzeszów and Bubby having been born in Oświęcim is, to us, her children and grandchildren who cannot properly pronounce or find on a map either city, negligible. And anyway, the errors are almost never discovered. The stories sit undisturbed and unprovoked, congeal into lore. No one is any the wiser. But what happens when the story is disturbed and provoked? When you seek to inspect or inhabit or engage with or build out parts of the story? Then the details do matter, especially the details you can touch and see and get up close to. Oświęcim and Rzeszów are more than 200 kilometers apart. The difference between Małachowskiego 12 and Małachowskiego 34 is, when you're asserting your rights as an heir, immense. Once you enter the story, the where and the what matter, because those are your access points. Those are the story's anchors, the myth containers. And to get that wrong, to chase down the wrong building or go to the wrong city, is to get your story wrong, to misfire, to suffer that private but sharp humiliation of having cared in the wrong direction.
So couldn't we say the same principle applies not only to family origin stories, but to Jewish collective memory itself? One quote I came across in Jewish studies is, the rabbis were not fundamentalists. The Torah itself is full of gaps, contradictions. It's not always in chronological order. It is by no means a historical textbook, but rather the story of the Jewish people. Written scripture was never meant to stand alone. The midrash and oral tradition serve to fill in the gaps and lend meaning to the text. Also to ensure its relevance to contemporary issues in different times and places, while new interpretations allow Judaism to adapt and transcend, and they have preserved us as a people to the present day, while accompanying us on our journey into the future. And I'm sorry, I didn't let you answer the question. Can it also be applied to the collective story of the Jewish people?
One more. Could you rephrase the question quickly?
You were saying that the errors and the things that were incorrect don't really affect the general story. They do and they don't. Mm-hmm. And I'm saying that the collective story of the Jewish people is similar. There's gaps.
Sure. Yeah, I think I'm not an expert in collective history for sure, and so, but I do think errors. It's sort of they're not errors as much as sort of things, the gaps in my knowledge, and I think we have certain familiar narratives which we inherit, and those often go unexamined. And once we push a little bit in, you're going to find that your familiar stories are much stranger and much richer than you thought, but not the same as you thought. And so I experienced them as errors because I was wrong, but sort of the end result was a much richer and more nuanced and stranger story, which I'm very grateful for. And and on collective memory too, I think there's some very easy narratives that we sort of go along with as a default. And once those get examined, once you interrogate them, they break a little bit. But then you sort of have to repair them and they become all the richer for it.
Right. The courtroom scene in the book has you testifying about the deaths of your grandfather's family, which you mentioned before, of which he is the sole survivor. Having to prove those deaths is a long, frustrating process in the face of a type of skepticism that may or may not be anti-Semitic. You even have an encounter with your translator, who seems to be a missionary of sorts, trying to subtly convert you to Christianity, which I found to be profoundly ironic and tone deaf. On my visit, one of my guides was a young professor who grew up close to Auschwitz-Birkenau, but was never taught that Jews were murdered there. He went on to study Jewish history, Hasidism. He visits Israel. He's even fluent in Hebrew. Do you think that suppression of the Jewish experience under communism until the late 80s has contributed to widespread ignorance about Jews and the Holocaust in Poland?
Yep. Yes. That's a one-word answer. I do.
Yeah.
I want to emphasize that I don't speak Polish, and so my knowledge, my insight is limited, and I think that's important to note. And so I don't have really much insight into the curricula or like how certain Polish people experience things. I have found, my experience in Poland has been one where most Poles I met were extremely supportive and curious, with a small pocket of very well-informed, activists in the space of Jewish memory. And so I think, to me, a lot of the Jewish energy is actually fueled by non-Jews, and especially in the smaller cities, it's just not going to be done by anyone else. And so the people sort of often, for no money, undertaking this on a volunteer basis are non-Jews, who are sort of preserving the cemeteries, preserving the shuls, putting together programs or festivals or whatever it is. And so I think there's been like a tremendous amount of progress made since independence, but for sure, for a very long time, I think like a real unadulterated history was suppressed. And that takes a long time to undo.
Did you come across any people that were Polish that had Jewish roots and they wanted to explore their Jewish roots? Like they found out much later that they had Jewish roots.
Tons. I probably personally know close to 30 Polish people who are in the process or who have already converted to Judaism, and almost all of them were doing an Orthodox conversion, so it was quite a serious commitment. And so, my Yiddish teacher actually in Colombia was a native Krakowian who,
Wow.
and she got interested in Yiddish and found out she's Jewish, and now she lives in New York and sends her kids to Heschel.
Wow, that's unbelievable.
So there's just a huge number of people, and now I'm hearing from people since the book came out.
I think there are people in the book that had Jewish ancestors as well, if I'm not mistaken.
Even one of the treasure hunters
Yeah.
was someone like that.
Right. So interesting. You then contrast this skepticism with a total lack of skepticism about the many conspiracy theories connected with the treasure hunter culture. And these are extensive and pretty bizarre. Things like anti-gravity, spaceships, aliens, and time travel. You write that these theories may be a response to the enormity and incomprehensibility of the Holocaust. Can you expand a little bit on that as well?
Sure. Okay. Yeah, it's kind of a big chapter. So, when I was hanging out with the treasure hunters, I kept hearing about different conspiracy theories, very sort of strange ones about like UFOs or flying saucers or aliens or anti-gravity machines or time travel or ancient occult alliances with the Nazis. And my initial instinct was to dismiss them. It was to be like, these are silly, not worth my time. They seem relatively harmless. Like, what's the harm? But as I sort of got deeper in, I met more of the treasure hunters, spent more time with them. This stuff not only didn't go away, but sort of revealed itself as basically emblematic, or like it was a system-wide issue. And so it was just really not ubiquitous, but not that far either. And so I ended up I spent about 6 months researching, I would say, Nazi-centric conspiracy theories, mostly through the lens of anti-gravity. And I've sort of discovered there was like a real pernicious underside to a lot of these beliefs, in the sense of there's a form of historical revisionism that's not immediately apparent because you're like, ha ha ha, a Nazi flying saucer, who cares? But then when you sort of get deeper in and start of understanding the worldview in which these conspiracy theories are proliferating, you see a revisionism at work, which is kind of, the way I put it is rebalancing the moral weight of the war. And so they're re-emphasizing that, like, what the Nazis' technological arc, and I implicitly or even often explicitly sort of making the Nazis the protagonists, and sort of making like the end goal sort of this technology, and sort of the Jews or all the victims become incidental, and sometimes even antagonists if they really are going in deep. And so you would read these books, 700-page book about, about World War II, and there'd be no mention of Jews dying. It would just be about an anti-gravity machine. And so I do think, and most of the treasure hunters were not sort of aware of this, but I did start, gaining an understanding of how dangerous and noxious some of these beliefs can be.
Right. Unfortunately, these crazy conspiracy theories have real world consequences, as you mentioned, like an Ernest Zundel or the Pittsburgh Synagogue massacre. Do you think that books like Plunder can help educate people about what actually took place to combat Holocaust denial, revisionism, or whitewashing?
Probably not. That's the truth. Probably not. But not.
I disagree.
I would say, I don't think anyone's going to read my book, and, someone who has these beliefs and read my book and be like, wow, I see the light. But I would like to think that, the contribution I made is sort of to the people. I don't know how to talk to conspiracy theory believers, but I do think what is important is to talk to the people in the middle. I think there's like the huge chunk of people do not care and think it's funny. And which is a completely understandable thing. When you read about, Nazi anti-gravity machines, almost everyone is going to be, that is a ridiculous proposition. There's nothing to be concerned about. And I would like to think my contribution here is a limited one, but it helps peel back these belief systems and expose the workings of it. And so, yeah, and it happens in a mass media context as well. And so, like, if you turn on the Discovery Channel, they have a huge amount of documentaries about Nazis, and that they're not that far from this. And these are on like major American networks. It's sort of about like secret Nazi technology. So like, I don't think you're going to see them talk about anti-gravity, but they start floating like these theories, and you're like, this is dumb, this is stupid. But you're like, again, without anyone necessarily being intentional, you're like, the larger question looms is that, how do we tell the story of the war? And so if you're sort of like leaving these very influential like media outlets and saying the story of the war is one of like these crazy things that the Nazis did, and they, some of the stuff is true, like some of the technology that Nazis developed is, pretty fantastic, and it's pretty like wild and semi sci-fi. But I do think there's a responsibility on how to frame and contextualize the war as one of genocide, and one of like the sort of evil that the world has never seen, and sort of who the aggressors are, who are the victims. So I was like, if I made a contribution to this discourse, I would like to think it's that, of sort of exposing maybe dangers that weren't necessarily obvious to the average reader or viewer.
Right. Throughout the book, you encounter people and places that inhabit the spaces where Jewish communities once lived, and where labor camps and smaller, more obscure concentration camps once stood, but have disappeared. There's a sense that Jewish history lies just beneath the surface, but is on its way to being swallowed up and lost forever, if not already forgotten. Shouldn't we all have as precise a knowledge of our family stories as possible, if only to raise awareness and prevent these atrocities from happening again?
Yeah, I don't know. So like this has been a really interesting exercise of like writing this book and then talking about the book to audiences, as like, am I a representative of sort of, or a spokesperson? So like, I feel very good and comfortable within my own little tiny space about my own family and the meaning thereof. I think it is somewhat difficult to extrapolate lessons to other families because they can be so complicated
and so murky, and they depend so much on like personal relationships, which might not transfer from one family to another. But I would say, I don't know if to me, the word important is one that I'm uncomfortable with. It's very hard to sort of say what is and what is not important for other people to do. But I will say, from experience, anecdotally, seeing a lot of people I know do stuff like this, it's unbelievably meaningful. That exploration of family roots, whatever will or will not turn up, and it will not go as you anticipate, and it will reveal meaning in ways you never would have thought. And so I have found it to be an unbelievably enriching experience. I don't know if you're going to like learn more about this person or that person, but you're going to start asking yourself questions that it's very difficult to sort of frame in any other context without like a sort of roots exploration. And so that I would like encourage it. I wouldn't like mandate, but I would really be very encouraging for people to sort of excavate their ancestry.
Right. Over the years, you spent a lot of time in Poland and met and interviewed dozens of Poles. Do you feel that your interactions and relationships with Polish people have provided a valuable insight and a clue about how Jews and Poles can reconcile and dialogue and hear each other's stories?
Oh, interesting. Maybe. I think a lot of people who haven't been to Poland, who grew up with survivor grandparents or survivor parents, or in a community where those narratives were really prioritized, have a very and totally justified sort of preconception of what Poland might be like and what Poles might be like. That preconception is probably wrong. And so in my time there, going for about a decade, again, the support and curiosity, both on a personal level and also on an institutional level, are really immense. And so, yeah, the government, huge step backwards in terms of like how institutional memory is functioning in that country. But on a local, like on a municipal level, and like a lot of like artists and writers and scholars, and you mentioned like the guide who took you to Auschwitz, putting together some of these Jewish festivals. There is a really rich discourse going on. And so, I'm not a policymaker, or I don't even know nonprofit stuff. Like that's sort of beyond my purview. But yeah, I even personally going for 10 years, I was able to see progress from the beginning to the end. Starting in 2000 and I'm trying to remember when the first time I went was 2011 till like 2019. Just a tremendous, like, it's just things get disseminated. And like, when you sort of reduce those interactions, yeah, they end up being sort of conversations of people sort of hearing people. I think also the sort of books that are published has really expanded in Poland. I think there's like different foundations that have just been more open to publishing like what might be considered challenging books in the Polish narrative. And I think also there's responsibilities on our side as well. I think often people they have a kind of a caricature of what Poland might be, like a very sort of superficial sense, without really any sort of understanding or context of Polish history. And they sort of see it as antagonistic. And like the end goal is to not make one that's antagonistic, and then one is to make one that's sort of holistic and integrated. And so, yeah, I've had some really moving experiences, and I've learned a great deal, and I'd like to think I've shared my story with a lot of people.
There's a part in the book after you show your father the old family movies when he seems disturbed about your pursuit of your grandfather's building and says it's not what he would have wanted. Do you think that religious observance is the legacy your father believed is the only worthy one to pursue?
Could you say the last sentence again? I didn't hear.
Do you think that religious observance is the legacy your father believes is the only worthy one to pursue?
I wouldn't say only worthy one. I would say it's sort of the frame for him. It's where everything happens. It's sort of like it's not a channel. It's everything. And so like religion is all encompassing. So the way I grew up, it's sort of like you couldn't separate your religious observance from really anything else. And so within that space, certain things like all these questions about sentimentality and memory are going to happen. But
yeah, for sure. How I grew up and, how my father taught me and how my father relates is definitely one within a religious framework.
You then discuss the spiritual in Judaism, the holy ritual objects and custom or minhag, which is particular to families, a legacy passed down, but interrupted by the Holocaust and often lost, along with family members who perished. In the family movie, your grandfather is performing his own particular Havdalah ritual, which is then remembered by your father. So there's a bit of a reversal there. By screening the film, you are restoring the minhag that your father had forgotten. Has your father since taken up this forgotten Havdalah minhag? Have any other family members picked it up? And will it now be passed down to future generations in your family?
So, I mean, within the Orthodox like customs, I have three older sisters who are either were married or are married, and so basically, the way it works where I come from is that the wife generally adopts her husband's customs,
Oh,
and
okay.
so, but when I do it, when I make Abdallah, I now sort of integrate that
Oh,
custom,
wow.
and so. Yeah, I wonder about my cousins. I actually don't know about my male cousins if this is now a thing for them. I am not sure.
Did all your cousins read the book?
No,
Oh,
a number of them read it and told the others maybe the juicy parts, uh,
okay.
but I don't think so. Yeah, I mean, some people are curious about some stuff and not as curious about other stuff.
When you discover your grandfather's cousin, Abraham Kaiser, and his sister's descendants, you discover another legacy, a whole branch of your family. You write that Abraham's Hebrew memoir serves as a testament. His memories are a treasure, and his diary, a record of those memories, he painstakingly wrote on a cement package paper and rode around on a bicycle to retrieve them after the war. In contrast, the Polish diary, published 10 years later, has a completely different, you could even say opposite meaning to Poles. This reminded me of an essay I read about Elie Wiesel's original Yiddish memoir, which was later translated to French and published as the first version of the book Night. According to this essay, the Yiddish contained an unrestrained rage compared to the French, which was tempered in order to appeal to a wider non-Jewish audience. Do you believe these changes in tone upon translation to Polish or other languages and the reception of the translation indicate insurmountable differences in culture that are impossible to bridge?
That's a big one. Let's see. Well, I do think one that not every difference in culture should be bridged. I don't know if that's I think there's just some things that are going to be different, and that's fine. This is like a little bit of a trickier one, but yeah. So the book functions very differently in Israeli context, and it as opposed to the Polish context, and that it's strange. Like the one in Israel is out of print; you can't find it. It's basically a forgotten text. And that operates one like Holocaust memory, and it's very old Holocaust memory, and it was sort of before the Eichmann trials, and so sort of never got. It was sort of the pre-Holocaust consciousness. It happened in the early 50s, and the one in Poland isn't really a Holocaust text, even though it's the same text more or less. It's a treasure hunter text, and it's celebrated, constantly reprinted, studied, pored over, passed down, commented on. And so, yeah, they have these very different legacies because they are serving different purposes to different people. And so, yeah, I don't have any like prescriptive comments on like, should it be this or should it be that? But it's very striking, like the difference between these two books, which are, again, the same book.
Right. Somehow you're able to flesh out the story of Abraham's redemption. I don't want to give it away for people who haven't read the book yet, but the story proves ultimately to be romantic, tragic, but uplifting, and it turns the book on its head. It contrasts with the dark heaviness of the previous sections, and it's a powerful example of the many stories of non-Jews who risked their lives to hide or save Jews from death. And every survivor seems to have relied on people like this at one time or another. How did you first hear about the Plonskers, which then led you to find Alexander, the son of Abraham's Redeemer?
Oh, it was actually the other way around. So basically,
Oh,
yeah, when I was in Israel meeting some Abraham's great nephew, he was like, "Hey, did you know that the German woman who saved him was actually recognized by Yad Vashem?" And I hadn't known. And so once I had that note, I contacted Yad Vashem. I said, "Could you give me the file?" It took about 6 months. They sent me the file, and Alexander Froelich had his phone number on them. It was still the same number, and so I got in touch with him, and he told me the story of the Plonskers. I was never in contact with the Plonskers themselves, but it was still a quite something, yeah.
It's amazing. Would you agree that one real treasure that we all discover by reading about your journey is the good in people that transcends evil and makes life worth living?
I mean, I think your opinion is as valid as mine on this one. Did you feel that?
Yes.
Then I'll take it.
To me, your memoir proves to be, like Silesia itself, a multi-layered land that reveals more wondrous revelations as we go deeper and deeper into the story. It's also a testament for future generations. Are you still embroiled in your quest to reclaim the building?
Yep. Still ongoing. There's been progress, but kind of incremental. So we'll see.
The epilogue contains the story of Steve, who is searching for a very specific treasure. Can you briefly describe his story, very briefly? And did his family finally permit you to tell us what happens after you yourself removed the brick in the wall?
Sure. So basically, I met this guy, Steve, who had this incredible story about his father-in-law hiding 10 golden eggs, before he had his house seized. And Steve had this hand-drawn map of where the eggs would be. I had met them on this trip, and I sort of asked him about it, and he invited me along to go look for the actual golden eggs in this woman's attic. And so we sort of got to the attic. First we sort of did like a little white lie to get there, but then we ended up telling the truth. And the woman was very supportive and let us remove the bricks. And the book ends with me removing the brick and not telling the reader if the eggs were in fact there. And so I do not yet have permission to say whether the eggs are actually there.
Okay. What's your next project?
So I hope to go back. I was writing fiction before this, and so I have a pretty much finished novel about Yiddish poets in New York City in interwar times. And so I haven't looked at it in quite some time, and so I'm hoping it's kept up. I'm hoping it's not horrible. And so, yeah, slowly turning back to, writing some longer essays and some reviews. But the idea is the next big project to hopefully be a novel.
Great. Looking forward to that one. I'd like to remind everyone, if they have any questions, please type them into the chat box. First question is, has anyone ever made the connection between the system of Nazi tunnels and the Hamas tunnels that Israel destroyed, that are used to hide terrorists, infiltrate Israel, and kidnap civilians or store weapons?
Some people, I haven't seen like that in like the quote unquote literature, but I certainly over the last few months, as I've done some book talks, some people have made connections like that. But I don't know anything about the Hamas tunnels, so I'm pretty ignorant about it. So I don't know.
Okay. Today, there seems to be a convergence between right-wing and white supremacist anti-Semitism and left-wing anti-Zionism. Swastikas are turning up at so-called pro-Palestinian rallies. Israelis are accused of genocide and ethnic cleansing. Recently, violence has broken out against Jews all over the world. Canada and the US, along with dozens of countries and institutions, have adopted the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. Do you think this is an effective strategy to stem the alarming rise in hate speech and violence against Jews today?
I'll be honest, this is outside my expertise. So I'm gonna
You're going to pass?
gently say no comment. I don't, yeah, my opinions are not more informed than anyone else's here. So,
Okay. When you were in Poland, did you see the Jewish figurines with the bags of money?
I sure did. It's very hard to miss.
Did you ask people what they represent, or?
Not only that, so basically to fill in for people who aren't familiar, there's a very old folk tradition in Poland of the Jew, and so there's like a little toy figurine of like a Jew that people buy for good luck or for help with their business, and they put it in their store in their home. And so I was actually, a very good friend of mine started an arts festival called Festivalt. And then as one of their main pieces, they actually installed real life Lucky Jews, like in the town square. And so like a Jew, someone would get dressed up in sort of how the figurines, like sort of stereotypical Jewish, and sort of sit there and interact with Poles about this practice. And I was one of the lucky Jews. So I'm very familiar. Yeah, I was like we had some wild interactions with some locals. I would say 98% really positive and interesting and provocative in the best possible way. And so it's an interesting custom because it's it has some similarities to like in the South, in the States, how some people might have certain like Black folk art without necessarily understanding like the racism. And so most Poles who it's very much older. You're not going to meet like anyone under 40 who are doing this sort of stuff, who have it in their business or home. But for sure for the older generations, it's kind of common. And so, but most of them would be like shocked that you think it's wrong. And so I have two friends who've actually done their doctorates on this question. And it becomes like a really complicated question about folk art and representation, what it means to one party, what it means to another party. And so, yeah, like a really rich question.
Okay, we almost forgot about your photographs. Do you have any photographs to show us?
Oh, sure. Let me show some of the tunnels that I mentioned. And so this is one of the smaller tunnels. For those who read the book, this is the first one I go to. It's called Sorbonne. This is actually a picture from that occasion when I went in for the first time, and you can see these wooden A-frames, which are the same ones from the war. This one is not open to the public, so basically you need a guide or the GPS coordinates to know where to go. This is another photo from that tunnel. So this one is from Osufka, which is one of the largest ones. And here, this one is open to the public. It's run kind of like a state park. So you like sort of get a guide. And this one has, you can start seeing the reinforced concrete. And so like 10% of it has reinforced concrete, but you can start getting a sense of what it might have looked like. And here you can see, because these rail tracks, this is how they would cart out the rubble and sort of bring equipment in. And the engineering wise, they would sort of build one tunnel and then a second tunnel directly on top running parallel, and then collapse the sort of the dirt in between them to create a much larger tunnel. And so this is a room, the scale is hard to appreciate, but this ceiling is something like 20 or 25 meters tall and like 80 meters long. And so it's quite enormous. And so when you go down there, like this scale is really staggering. Yeah, again, since the scale is hard to appreciate, but from where the photographer is standing till the end of the back room, there's a whole second room behind. It's like 200 meters. And so it's just like, again, the size of these things is really, really enormous. And then for those who read the book, I mentioned in my chapter on conspiracy theories, it opens with a giant rig that the conspiracy theorists believe was a testing rig for Nazi flying saucers. And so this is that.
Wow.
And again, it's hard to appreciate how tall this thing is. It's like that fence is about as tall as I am. And this it really is an enormous structure.
Wow.
Yeah.
So those are the photos.
Cool. Great. Well, we want to thank you so much for speaking with us this evening, and I'd like to thank all our viewers. Where can everybody find your book? I guess it's on all the
Yeah, book is
usual
available where books are sold, and in Canada, Amazon or your local bookstore, or all those places. You could also, I saw, okay. Also, people want to reach out to me directly. I see my emails there. Okay, it's there a second. Feel free if you have stories about reclamation, restitution, or want to share or advice or give me advice. I'd love to hear it. And then, yeah, the book, wherever books are sold, Kindle or Audible. I am actually the narrator on the audiobook. So if you think my voice is nice, you could listen to it for 9 hours. But yeah, please, if you read the book and want to tell me what you think, even especially if you don't like it, I'd love to hear. But yeah, I thank you guys so much for coming.
There's just one more announcement. It looks like somebody sent this in. The Forest Hill Jewish Center on Spadina Road has a trip planned to Poland this October 10th to 17th, open to anyone.
Huh.
So I just wanted to throw that out there. And thank you, Menachem, again. It's a pleasure to speak to you. And thank you, everyone, for joining. And good night, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.